Okay, well, thank you for everyone coming today to our May event for NE Bytes, all around Azure virtual desktop with Azim Manjee, who's joining us from Microsoft. So usual kind of things that I mentioned, our events page, our Twitter, and our email are all there on the screen. Our code of conduct is on the website, and any comments, suggestions, anybody has an idea for a talk, anything like that, please get in contact with me either through the email, through Twitter, or Brett and I both. There are personal Twitter handles as well, so please reach out if you want to do that. So reminder, Microsoft Build is next week. What we used to do when we would do this in person is we'd sometimes have an event where we'd actually sit down and kind of watch it together in our venue. But of course, we're not going to be able to do that this year. So so that's there, ready for sign up if anybody wants to go ahead and see that. Right, the main topic tonight is around Windows Virtual Desktop and virtual desktop infrastructure, and we're really pleased to have Azim with us today. He's Senior Cloud Solutions Architect at Microsoft, and I've been working with him over the last few months and really been enjoying benefiting from his expertise. So I will hand over to Azim, and we'll kick off.
Yeah, so nice to meet you all. I'm actually out of the United States in Atlanta, and I've been at Microsoft for 2 years-ish, and I'm actually about to change roles. So I'll be starting a new role, working with what they are going to call Cloud PC. So I can't talk much about that right now, but there is some new cool stuff coming out called Cloud PC that is here. Let me go ahead and actually start screen sharing. Sorry about that. But yeah, today we're going to talk about Windows Virtual Desktop, and it's kind of meant to be really fast, zero to a hero, type stuff. So really let you hit the ground running with it, and just kind of take customers through and people through not only how to build it, but what's it for. We'll start with what's it for, the why, and then we'll talk about how to quickly build it. Whether you're already no matter what sort of state you are in Azure, whether you don't have anything in Azure, or maybe you've got some hybrid data connectivity, between Azure and your data center, or in my case, Azure and your house. And then we'll kind of go into some of the requirements of building it and stuff like that. So just to kind of since there's an event, sorry. So just to kind of get into like what is the WVD environment. So if any of you all have worked with, let's see a show of hands. Anyone worked with VDI before? I know, I know Derek has, but anyone else on this call played with VDI, RDS, Citrix, VMware, any of that kind of stuff? Maybe, maybe not. So if you have, VDI is essentially the ability to deliver a desktop interface or an application that's maybe Win32 fat client type application through a broker service, so that you can actually have let users enjoy that VDI offering, right? And so I'm actually going to give you kind of a quick demo of what that looks like. So in the Windows Virtual Desktop world, we actually have a web-based client. So there's multiple clients that you can connect from. There's the fat client, what I'll refer to, which is the remote desktop application that lives in that you can install in Windows or Mac, that looks like this. And then there's also the web-based client, which we actually have a HTML5 client that allows you to see these desktops and actually log into these applications. So all these icons you see here, these are all Windows apps, not web apps, even though this is in a Chrome browser, not even Edge, but Chromium. And what I can actually do is I can log into one of these VMs. Essentially in the back end, they are VMs, and bring up a full desktop interface, into in the web, and not only that, sort of bastion into my network on-prem. So one of the cool things that it sort of allows you to do, and let me just unzoom here because it looks like I was zooming in. The HTML5 browser doesn't quite like it when you're doing zoom in your browser, but it'll sort of resize based on you moving the window around. At least it should. And so ultimately, let me just trigger the resize. There we go. And so ultimately, I'm in a VM, full VM desktop in a web browser. And as you can tell, it feels pretty natural, right? And I can open up, all kinds of tools and basically treat it like a cloud-based PC. And so one of the coolest things that I like to use this for is actually getting back into my home network. And so this machine is joined to my on-prem domain, right? And I can use it to access my on-prem network because that's how I've set up. So this machine lives in a virtual network in Azure that is connected to a VPN, and then my home firewall is on the other side of that VPN, allowing that traffic. So if I did like an IP config on this machine, right, it's going to show a 192.168 address. But if I do like a ping azim.network, right, that's my on-prem domain, it's going to resolve another network, right? And so this is actually an Azure-based domain controller because I keep DCs in Azure. But ultimately, my on-prem here at the house is a /24 network. And I know we're kind of getting into some weeds around the networking a little bit, but I will say the one of the most important things that you need for WVD, which we'll get into, is some of the networking requirements. But ultimately, what I want to demonstrate is the ability to connect back into my network. And I'm going to do that by SSHing into a Raspberry Pi that actually sits in my kitchen right now. Just to demonstrate, this VM is a real VM, right? I'm SSHing, and not only that, I'm moving laterally back into my network in almost sort of a bastion sense, right? And so the cool part about this is there's no public IP on this VM, right? I don't have to create any kind of broker service on the front end, or any kind of front door service, or secure any kind of attack surface. I don't have to manage SSL certs or anything like that. It's part of the Microsoft WVD service that this machine has this connection, and I can use Azure AD to get to this machine. So I'm going to demonstrate what that looks like in a minute. But what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to demonstrate that I'm on this Raspberry Pi, and then we'll kind of move on. So this Raspberry Pi is sort of an IoT project I'm working on. It is sitting in my window in my kitchen, monitoring the cars driving by and doing a time over distance calculation to see if they are speeding or not. And then if they go over a certain speed, it just captures a picture of them. It's sort of a separate project, but Azure doesn't offer a Raspberry Pi, so that's kind of why I'm demonstrating that I'm connected to a Raspberry Pi, because you sort of have to own one of those to connect into it. So ultimately, I am going to show what this kind of looks like from an architecture perspective. So the architecture as such with this is ultimately, in the old days of VDI, whether it was Citrix, VMware, or RDS, you had a series of components you had to create. So you'd have to create, obviously the host pools, right? So the servers that your users actually log into, or you actually log into, right? But not only that, you had to create what we call, management and broker services. So you had licensing servers, you had web access, or gateway servers, broker services that would sort of channel you back to the backend VM. And by virtue of that, now you've got to manage DNS settings, you've got to manage SSL certificates. You also have to protect the public IP that those services are exposed on in your data center. And so all of those things, including the hosts, you had to manage, right? And so what Windows Virtual Desktop does is we've sort of taken all the stuff that people hated about doing VDI, so all that broker service, basically everything up here, and we turned it into a SaaS service. And so basically, you have this service that's part of your Windows 10 licenses, and we'll get into licensing in just a second. It's everyone's favorite topic. And we basically deliver these desktops through that service. And so what we've done is we've said, okay, all the stuff that people don't want to deal with, the SSL certs and all of that, right? Public IPs, the attack surface, we've taken that and we put it inside Azure AD as an application. And so if I were to try to log into the RD Web service, for instance, so you'll notice the address for the Windows Desktop service is rdweb.wvd.microsoft.com, right? That's a Microsoft address. It's not one of your addresses. You don't have to worry about managing the DNS for it. You don't have to load balance it. You don't have to deliver it through a front door. We're kind of doing all that for you. And so once I hit that in this incognito window, which apparently I already had an incognito window open somewhere, so I'm going to do that again. I apologize. I'm going to get hit by Azure AD, right? And by virtue of using Azure AD, it's going to leverage conditional access. And conditional access, if you don't know, is a means of setting up certain rules for users authenticating into applications in Azure AD. So I can actually say, hey, users must MFA into this application. They must come from a company-owned device. The device must be compliant. So maybe they've got to turn their firewall on and have up-to-date antivirus signatures, right? This is all really important stuff lately, especially. So, you know, these kinds of controls are really important. You can also say they can only come from a certain country. So for instance, in my environment, I don't allow logins outside the US, especially with the pandemic going on. I just haven't been traveling. And so there's no need for me to allow people to sign in. And so if I was violating any of these conditional access rules, right, I would get the "you can't get there from here" sign. So ultimately, we've taken that SaaS service and we've kind of put it in this Azure AD application. And then behind that, what we're doing is we're delivering the thing you actually care about, which is the desktop hosts themselves. And so, you know, in the case of many customers, these are end user cloud-based desktops designed to give them sort of the same experience that they have, you know, on their own PC, right? And so it's a Windows 10 experience, which is generally speaking very familiar to a lot of users, or in some cases, you know, needing to deliver Windows to maybe a heavy Mac population, right? There's a lot of different reasons why you might want to do VDI. We're not going to spend too much time in that today, but if you do want to talk through that, I'm always available to talk to people about that. You know, and then of course, the thing that you don't have to manage, right? The actual data center itself, right? So all of this runs in Azure. And the other thing that this sort of did for a lot of people that was really kind of a big deal, what they called the game changer, right? Some people refer to things as game changers. Obviously, the SaaS service was a big deal, but then also the ability to deliver a multi-session user experience on Windows 10. And so, you know, if you're familiar with VDI, in the old days, if you wanted to have what we call high density, many users logging into the same VM, you had to do Windows Server, and you had to buy RDS cals. You know, and we had this whole crazy model for sort of delivering that, you know, and a lot of people found it kind of painful, I feel like. And so what we've done is we said, okay, we're going to create this special version of Windows, and we're going to make it multi-session, but it's Windows 10. So everyone who's used to having that consistent Windows 10 experience can continue to do so. But what we can do is we can deliver a stronger economic use case, right? Where we can say, instead of giving users their own little VMs, which is what's been done traditionally when they wanted to deliver, you know, a desktop interface. Now we're going to be able to do that with higher density. So I can pile as many users as I want into a particular VM before it gets overutilized, and then I can do, you know, scaling and load balancing and stuff like that. And so that kind of takes me to the next sort of phase, right? In terms of like, what is that and why would you do that, right? And so what changes things, right, is that user profile, right? What happens when, you know, you've got these multi-session pools and a user could theoretically land on one machine and then land on another machine in the other part of the day, and you might have multiple users, right? And so how do we deal with the user profile? Because, you know, if you're a Windows person, you know, as soon as that user logs in, a user profile generates, right? And those user profiles take up space. And not only that, they contain the user data, and the user, if they sign into one machine one day and another machine in another day, and they find that there's a difference in files, that's going to result in a help desk ticket. And if you're in IT, your main goal is to reduce those kinds of cases and, you know, create that really awesome, consistent user experience. So the third big game changer that sort of came of all of this was the acquisition of FS Logix. So we essentially purchased a company called FS Logix, who what it is it's some software that we install on the machine, and it allows us to obfuscate that user profile and a bunch of other things into a file share. So kind of like user profile disks, but a little bit easier to deal with. And so what this does is it actually really quickly attaches that VHD living on an SMB share somewhere to the VM as the user signing in. And from that user's perspective, they could be signing into one machine or another machine, and they would have no idea. All their files are just going to appear. Their user profile is just going to appear. You'll notice in my VDI environment, I've got a really cool picture of Jupyter as my background, right? If I were to show you the background on my PC here at the house, if I minimize all this stuff, you'll see it's very similar to that picture of Jupyter, maybe cropped a little bit, but ultimately it's the same picture, right? And essentially what I'm doing is I'm using Azure AD and Intune to redirect like my whole user profile into my OneDrive and a lot of my settings in Azure AD. And so because I'm doing that, when I log into my cloud-based VMs, a lot of my files, a lot of my user profile stuff, they just kind of come along with. And so I get this really awesome, consistent user experience around, how this all works. And so let me actually resize this window a little bit because I think I'm not showing it. But ultimately, it's this Windows 10 experience. And so pretty cool. The other really cool part is it's a way for me to get into my environment without exposing a single public IP, right? The reality of my lab here at my household is that if you can get onto my network and you know what you're doing, you could theoretically find your way into my home automation system and open my front door. And so, from my perspective, that means there's a physical security impact there, or a potential impact for physical security by having my virtual security exposed. And so from my perspective, I need to close all of those kinds of firewall holes and really restrict the ability to get into my environment. And so what I've done is I've used things like Windows Virtual Desktop and Azure App Proxy to stick MFA onto applications that don't really have MFA, and really obfuscate those applications from the outside world without some kind of additional security, preventing someone from being able to do something like open my garage door from their phone without actually living here or anything like that. And so it's kind of an important aspect for me, and it is how I'm delivering some additional security. So that's my silly home use case that I use, but you can probably imagine any kind of commercial application where that might be valid. I've got customers using this for developers in different regions as a bastion into their own data center, using delivering their own applications from their on-prem through this service. So there's a lot of different use cases for this kind of VDI. The other thing that I will sort of quickly demonstrate is the ability to treat this as like an administrative bastion. So I actually use this to access like MMC consoles, like Azure Active Directory users and computers, or Visual Studio Code, or different applications that actually live in my network without having to expose anything seriously, right? And then I don't need to install RSAT on every single machine that I have, because I can come here and run Hyper-V Manager or Active Directory users and computers or the DNS console, right? And so these applications can just be run from right here, and it's sort of no problem. Oh wait, nope. I administer my DNS environment as well as hop into my Hyper-V machines, and it's really just like an app. On the FAT client, it streams the app as a window, and you wouldn't even really know it was a window, right? And so it's similar to the old remote app days. And so that's kind of the what is and the why WVD. I'm going to start getting a little bit more technical now that you guys have seen kind of what this product can do and how it might fit in a couple different scenarios that you might see at your job. We're going to get into like, how do we build this, right? Because 0 to hero, right? We got to start somewhere, right? And in order to draw a line, you got to draw 2 points. And so hopefully the end point of this call is hero. And if there's any questions or anything like that, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we'll take some time at the end too to ask any questions. So by all means, just dump them in the chat, and we'll start working our way through them. So ultimately, these host pools are delivered in the Azure portal, right? And I'm going to kind of go back to my PowerPoint here a little bit. So ultimately, the main requirements that you're going to find for these host pools to deliver this service is we need to egress some pieces of traffic from Azure, and I'll help kind of give some documents on that. And then we need to be able to join a domain where the user principal name in that domain matches the user principal name of the users in Azure AD. And the reason why I say that is because typically a customer will be using AD Connect and they'll be synchronizing their users from on-premise. And in those scenarios, the usernames pretty much match up. But in a lot of cases, customers don't want to extend their domain because ultimately I'm joining an on-prem domain. And so they might not have, an on-prem domain connectivity in Azure, right? Because I need to drop these VMs into an Azure virtual network, right? And so these must live in Azure in order to work, because the way our connection broker service works is we don't pick up any traffic that doesn't come from Azure. It drops any traffic that doesn't come from Azure. So the VMs must live in Azure for you to be able to access them through our broker service, which means not only do they have to live in Azure, but you also have to have a domain service available in Azure, not Azure AD, but Azure AD domain services might work. Your traditional Kerberos type authentication that you get with MTLM and all that good stuff, or you're using like a VPN and you've extended your domain into Azure either via VPN using DNS, or you've added domain controllers and added that as a site, which is the more common scenario that I see long term. And so in my environment, I have those domain services in Azure already. If you're in a situation where you don't, you can leverage what's called Azure AD domain services, which provides essentially a managed domain in Azure where it syncs your users from your Azure AD into that domain, so that your usernames and passwords all match up. And it gives you this sort of managed domain that's isolated in its own network that doesn't really have access to any of your on-prem stuff, but you can deliver these desktops to your end users and give them Office and Teams and all the stuff that they want to use without really giving them access to your on-prem data center. So there are a lot of security use cases and reasons why you might do it that way. And I'm happy to discuss all the different sort of scenarios. But ultimately, the two main things that we need, really the main thing that we need, is that domain join. And it's really funny because a lot of people, think of WVD as this really complex thing, when really in all reality it's just a VM with a special agent that needs you to be able to join your domain. Which isn't super complicated, right, when it sounds like it, but believe it or not, a lot of customers can have trouble with some of the networking and things like that. And so the solution architects at Microsoft are usually around to help some of those customers, and then of course we have partner ecosystem that will help customers as well. But ultimately we want to deliver those VDIs to those users and redirect their user profiles. And we're going to kind of cover that today. So, the idea of the 0 to hero is that we want to go fast. And so, the key to going fast is not to just get started right away, but to actually maybe do something, right? There's something we need to do, right? In order to save a few hours of trial and error, I love this quote. We always want to take a few minutes to just look at the documentation. And so I'm going to put these all in the chat for those of you who want to review these docs. I'm not going to take you through the docs now, but the reason why I'm saying that is because this is like a big hot list of all the things you need to get started with WVD. And it's not really that big of a big read. And I'm going to take you through the building, but there is some stuff that you need to have in terms of prerequisites in order for you to deploy your first host pool. And so I've already kind of done a lot of that. So in this cooking show that we're doing here, I've already, prepared a lot of the ingredients by nature of having an established Azure environment. But if you're coming from zero, doing the Azure AD domain services path is definitely the path of least resistance, but there's drawbacks in that you won't be able to connect your on-prem data center and things like that unless you establish, a VPN or express route or something like that. And so ultimately, if you're in the Azure portal, what you will do is you'll search for Windows Virtual Desktop. And the first thing it's going to do is it's going to prompt you to create a host pool. And so that's pretty much the first step, right? And so obviously you need to have an Azure subscription. And I'm going to actually make a new resource group. Right, and hopefully you've got a good naming convention in Azure. We're going to call this the NE Bytes host pool. I'm going to dump this in East 2. And this is actually going to be a pooled host pool. So there's two types of host pools that exist, right? And so there's pooled, which is many to one VM. So many users signing into single VMs. That's where you're going to get your best total cost of ownership and best economic sort of position. There is the ability to do personal desktops, and I'll tell you why you might want to choose to do a personal desktop, because there is a downside to sharing resources. There are certain types of users who will have what we'll call maybe noisy neighbor syndrome, or they'll rub elbows a little too much. Those people are usually developers, anyone who's using voice technology. So with the exception of Microsoft Teams, most voice technologies do not like the multi-user environments. Teams has been sort of worked, the client, to work in a multi-user environment, and there is some specific stuff you got to do on that server to make that work. But ultimately, things like Cisco Jabber and Avaya and a lot of the other telephony systems I found, Genesis, sometimes they don't like sharing a VM, and a lot of it's the same reason developers don't like sharing a VM. They like to take control of specific ports, and if one application has that port, another application kind of can't. So, for example, IaaS developers do not want to share port 80 typically. They just kind of want it to themselves, and so they also don't like to share compute resources, and so very commonly developers will land in a personal pool, and they'll kind of have their own VM. Now, it still makes sense to redirect their user profile to another machine, and here's why. If you remember this little diagram I was showing earlier, right? We want to segregate those users from their machine. And the reason why we want to do that, or the user data from their machine, and the reason why we want to do that is because I want to make those VMs maybe a little bit more like a lemming and less like a pet, right? I want it to be more disposable. And the reason for that is if I'm having problems with that VM, or I want to make a change to the image, I don't want to use something like SCCM or do some kind of scripting to make changes to 150 VMs. I would rather just make a change to my one VM image, destroy all the VMs in my host pool, and then redeploy them, because it's invariably easier to just make that change and then deploy an ARM template. Whereas if you wanted to make a change, if it was a drastic change to all those VMs, it becomes more challenging, right? And so that change is typically around what software is installed, or maybe some kind of settings. In some cases, you might want to use group policy to make those setting changes. And I'll actually show you some cool ways to target the Windows Virtual Desktop hosts in a group policy using WMI. But ultimately, you'll want to pick between these. Most customers are choosing pooled because, well, it's where you get the best total cost of ownership. There's also the option for your load balancing algorithm. So breadth first means if you've got 4 VMs, your first user is going to sign into VM 0, your second user is going to sign into VM 1, and so forth until they're all got somebody, and then it starts over again. And so it just kind of keeps doing that until the VMs are full. Depth first is a little different. It will pile everyone into a single VM until that VM is full, and then it'll start to shift people to the next one. And so you can actually set the max limit per host to make sure that people are being balanced properly in the pooled and the depth versus breadth sort of situation. And so I'm actually going to choose depth first, but it's not really going to matter because I'm only deploying one VM. So once you've sort of got your first page figured out, there's really a couple pages here that you have to go through as your typical Azure portal ARM template. And I'm realizing that you can't actually see everything. So give me 1 second. Let me just change this. OBS Studio, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go. I hope that's a little bit more visible. I'm actually going to rewind for a second just to let you make sure you can see everything that I just showed you. So we set our Azure subscription. We created a resource group. I gave the host pool. This is the pool. This is the construct where all the servers live. So there's a couple different constructs in WVD, and we'll get through all of them. The host pool construct is where all the actual hosts live. The location is obviously the Azure region of which you're going to dump the metadata. So there's also a location where your host pools will live. And then we picked a pooled host pool type, obviously depth first, and then we set a session limit. So you can choose to add VMs or not. I typically do add my VMs, and I'll put them in the same RG as my host pool most commonly. You, of course, can do a different RG, or you can create a new one. And then you got to give the name for these VMs. These VMs are joining your domain, so they're going to need a prefix for a name. And there are limits to this. So if I go and call them something super crazy, it's going to complain about the length, because what we're doing is we're actually appending -00-01 as we add more machines to your host pool, and those machines join your domain. So typically you don't want conflicts in the name. You want to avoid too long of a name. It clearly won't let you, because that's going to be the machine's name in Active Directory. And so there are limits, character limits on that. So we're going to call this the NE Bytes. And then it's going to add its own dash and everything like that. You don't need to do a dash here. It actually complain about that. So you don't want to do that necessarily. Then you'll want to choose where that VM lives, right? Of course, the region that you choose will dictate what network it lands in. So of course, you know, in your standard sort of cloud approach, I can't have a VM in West that's on a network in East, right? Physics doesn't really allow for that scenario to occur. And so I need to make sure I've got my VM location happy with the region so that I can select my network, which is kind of down the page. Then you've got some availability options. So we can do availability zone or an availability set, right? This is how we sort of segregate these VMs logically to ensure that they're always up, right? At least some services are always up. And then of course I want to choose my image. Now, the way I like to do it, I like to grab my images from Microsoft, and then I will typically run some script on them, or let Intune or SCCM or whatever config management tool that I want to use to make those changes on those VMs. You can, of course, bring your own images. Most of my customers will not bring your own, but build your own image. Most of my customers will build an image off of the base and then sort of work with that, because they want certain pieces of software and things like that pre-baked in the machine. Sometimes they want to add language packs and stuff like that. A lot of my other customers are starting to move towards Azure Image Pipelines, where they're using essentially Packer, which is a HashiCorp product, to define a VM image as code. And so they let you sort of detonate scripts as part of that image build, and then it'll automatically go and sysprep that machine and dump it out as an image. So it's a really cool way of approaching imaging, because now you can always just make an image from the latest version that Microsoft provides, add your own little secret sauce to it, and stamp out an image, and you don't have to do the work of like manually doing any of that stuff, which no one really wants to do that anymore. You of course have to pick a virtual machine size, right? And so this will dictate kind of your cost, right? So the broker service doesn't cost anything. The only thing you really pay for is the licenses for Windows 10, which is usually typically done on your Office 365 subscription or Microsoft 365 subscription, and then the compute for the VMs on Azure. And so that's really the only things you'll pay for. So if you choose small VMs, it's cheaper. If you choose big VMs, it costs more, right? Standard sort of infrastructure as a service approach. You don't pay for the Windows license as part of the VM costs. So the VMs, you will pay the Linux rate for them as long as you're covered under your Microsoft licensing through your Microsoft 365, or if you've got RDS CALs with software assurance and blah, 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 because, everyone licensing is everyone's favorite topic. So I'm going to go ahead and select a B2S because I'm, pretty cheap and I like to run pretty lean on Azure. And so I'm going to go ahead and just pick one VM. And then, of course, you can pick your disk type. I actually always choose premium SSDs because I don't like things to be slow. But also, any VM that only has premium SSDs gets a 3 nines SLA. And so I automatically get 3 nines of availability on that VM from Microsoft just by having only premium disks attached. I usually leave this managed storage account with Boot Diagnostics in this state. I don't really like having a bunch of custom storage accounts around, and I'll do the typical managed storage account. This is where things get more interesting. Apparently, I don't have an East 2 network. Hold on one second. There we go. So I had to move it to East because, as I was saying earlier, you have to choose between the region and the network. They have to be the same. They can't be separate. And so once I switched my region to East, this is the common gotcha that people run into. It was able to discover the actual virtual network that I wanted to land this in. So I'm actually going to land this in my default subnet, right? I've got a bunch of different subnets here. I've got some secured ones. If you need to segregate or do security, NSGs or network security groups are the cheapest way to sort of establish rules on your network. They're not packet inspection, they're not IDS or IPS, but they will sort of be a traffic cop in that, if you say this type of traffic's not allowed, it just drops that traffic and it doesn't allow it. And so that's what this is. I can choose advanced and actually select an already existing NSG, or I could just choose none or choose a basic one. It'll create a basic one. I am not going to put public ports on this VM. There's absolutely no reason for me to do so because I'm not hosting any services. other than the WVD thing, and the WVD thing already gives me public access without the need for sticking a public IP on this VM. If you're putting a public IP on this VM and you aren't hosting some kind of service through it, you are doing yourself a security disservice. And so, I want you to be very judicious and careful about how you're throwing public IPs around. Here we get to the domain join. So this is actually a really important step. In your domain join, it's really important to note the specify domain or unit. This is a big gotcha. And I'm going to let this sort of hover over. And the reason why this is a big gotcha is because if your username is like mine, where it's Azim at manjee.me, if you remember, my network is not Manjee. My network is not manjee.me, it's azim.network, right? So if I did like, who am I, right? It's Azim/Azim. It's not Manjee/Azim, right? And so if you don't hit this yes button, it is going to search for your UPN suffix as your password or as your domain, right? And so what it's going to happen is the DNS in your network, which is hopefully pointed at your domain controllers, right? And so maybe I should cover that in a second, actually. It's going to try to look that up, and if it can't find it, it's going to fail to join the domain, and the whole host pool deployment is going to bomb out, right? And so it's really important to note that if those two don't match, you need to hit this yes button and put in your correct domain, right? What the actual domain is. So maybe it's domain.local, maybe it's corp.local, maybe it's whatever it happens to be. You will need to specify that, and it needs to resolve on DNS. When you create an Azure Virtual Network, by default, it's using Azure DNS, right? And so if you're bringing your own domain controller, if you're using Azure AD Domain Services, you will need to specify in Azure Networking the DNS. And I can show you how that's done. If you guys don't know, just ask it in the chat, and I'll cover it at the very end. I'm sort of assuming a little bit of Azure knowledge here, but happy to go into it if you guys haven't experienced that before. It's not something everyone does on a daily basis, so I try to remember that. They also do want you to provide a local account to set, in case domain join fails, you can still save the VMs by logging into them on the local account and doing some troubleshooting. It's actually really important. If your host pool fails to join, rather than deleting it and starting over, log into the machine and test why your domain join failed. Because if it's not DNS, hint, it's almost always DNS, then it's something else, and you need to go and do some troubleshooting, because rebaking the same cake over and over and over again with the host pool without really knowing why it failed, because you're not going to get good errors, it's going to be very cryptic, is a big time sink. And so logging into that VM just to look at the event viewer or do some troubleshooting, super important way of bypassing that roadblock. So I'm going to actually go ahead and call it local admin, because Microsoft won't let you choose administrator or admin or root for the local admin account. And they also want 12 characters. So next, we're going to join this to a workspace. So a workspace is a construct that exists in that we will group these services into that workspace and put them in an app group. And so I usually will have them join to a specific workspace. And so that's the construct that the user sees. So you provide users permissions, I believe, at the workspace level, possibly the app group level. We'll dig into that in a second. And then, of course, if you're doing any Azure tags, so I might say the customer is NE Bytes in this case, right? And my cost center is maybe research, right? And I can do some tagging, and that allows me to report out on cost and things like that. Once I'm done doing that, oops, something's not happy. I'm actually going to do no infrastructure redundancy. So, of course, Azure does its validation check at the end of every wizard, right? Microsoft loves wizards. And so at the end of the wizard, we do a validation check. And what you saw there was that the validation didn't pass because I didn't select an availability zone. So originally it was availability zone, and I didn't select anything. You can also choose an availability set instead and create an availability set. What I'm doing is just none, because I don't care, because I'm going to throw this in the trash once we're done. Once the validation is happy, I go ahead and hit the create button. And it's going to submit an ARM template to deploy that host pool. Now, here's where things get a little kind of funny. when they show you this deployment, it's actually a nested ARM template. So we grab a template to create the workspace and some of the other resources, but then subordinate to that is a nested ARM template that actually creates the VM. So you'll see it here. We created the host pool construct, we created our application group construct, we created our workspace, and then the VM creation is a subordinate template that exists. And so I always drill into that to double check to make sure that my VM creation works, because 95% of the failures in WVD happen on the VM creation, and 95% of those errors are because domain join didn't work. And so the reason why I harp so much on the domain join, I know it sounds so simple. Everyone's like, yeah, I've joined computers to domain before. That's no problem. How many people haven't done that, right? If you're in IT, it's one of the first things you probably learn, right? Especially if you're in the help desk, or if you're started out imaging PCs like me, almost invariably those errors are related to DNS. And so NE Bytes just put, it's always DNS in the chat. I'm putting a heart on that because it's exactly what happens every time. And so we'll actually watch this bake. And if you put in 10 VMs, instead of just one, you'd see all 10 starting to deploy, and it kind of does things in a sort of parallel fashion. It still does them in the right order. So the first thing it does is it creates the VM, then it joins it to the host pool. And so what happens there is, it's called the DSC extension script. So we actually inject a script on that VM to go and download a special agent. And then once the agent is installed, we inject the registration key, and that registration key goes and joins it to your host pool. Once that occurs, then we perform the domain join. They used to actually do it backwards, but now they've kind of switched it around. And I think it's mainly because you can still kind of troubleshoot and join your domain afterwards if it's just a single VM or something like that, and they want to give people the chance to troubleshoot. Normally what I do is I just sweep it all into the trash and I start over if I know why it failed. If I don't know why it failed, then I go into the VM and I do some troubleshooting. And that's kind of like my main sort of mode when I'm working with customers on this. So just to recap, what we've done is we've created our host pool, we created our workspace, and we've started that process, and we've gone through some of those prerequisites and all of the different gotchas that I've sort of encountered in my daily. And so one thing I'm going to do real quick actually is I'm going to take you into the Azure Virtual Network while we're waiting for this to bake, and I'm going to show you what that DNS configuration looks like. So in my network, I have a virtual WAN, which is probably a little fancy for me to have, and I've got a hub and spoke model where my vWAN hub lives, and then all my networks are sort of spoked off of that. And so I can manage DNS centrally through the vWAN, or I can choose individually on each network. And so in this case, my network is the AIRS VNet. And this is just my internal Microsoft subscription. And you can see all the different devices that are attached to this network, right? And we even see the NE Bytes NIC here. And maybe what I'll do is I'll zoom in a little bit. Oops. Right, there's my NE Bytes NIC. And so down here, you can see, obviously, we control our address space. We can see all the connected devices. There's subnets, and then there's DNS servers. And so DNS is configured at the network level, not the subnet level. I've had a lot of customers ask me if I can configure DNS at the subnet level. You cannot. What you can do is you can configure it on the NIC level. So I can actually go into an Azure NIC and say, I want this particular machine to have these DNS settings, and I want its IP to stay static, for instance. And so you can do stuff like that. What we don't recommend is going into the VM, opening up Network and Sharing Center, and modifying the NIC at the VM level. That always causes problems. And so you're better off going into a NIC on the Azure side and modifying it on the Azure side, because our DHCP servers will handle that for you. You should also never try to bring your own DHCP server to Azure. All it will do is cause you headaches. And so this is where I've got my DNS servers configured. So this is one of my ones in Azure, and then these three are the ones that I have on premise. So if that doesn't work, then it tries the next one. But I almost always want my DNS to come from Azure. I want my lookups to happen in Azure. I want my forwarder requests to not go back on-prem, but to go out from Azure. That way, when I'm accessing things like Office 365 or different services where they're trying to geolocate you to deliver the closest point of presence to you, they're not thinking that you're coming from your data center or from somewhere else. They know you're coming from Azure, and they're routing your traffic as efficiently as possible. If it looks like you're coming from your data center, then what you're going to have is sort of the hairpin effect, where there's going to be a ton of extra latency on those connections to whatever that service is, because they're coming from your data center and not Azure. And so all that traffic sort of routes in a really strange way. And so that's kind of how I try to set my network up, to make sure that I'm always being as efficient as possible with networking and where I'm egressing. It also is additional cost. If you constantly egress every piece of traffic out of Azure back to your data center, even if it's meant to stay in Azure, you're going to see your costs go up because they charge you for those. So those things are like, on a meter, and so you will pay for those. So some little tips and tricks from the field. Those are the kinds of things that that I like to build. One of the other things that's really handy to note is that with all of these ARM templates, with all of these deployments, you get what's called a template out of it. And so I can download this piece of code and redeploy one of these environments on a whim. I can save this in my GitHub, and I can modify it, and then I can do more automated approach to my employments. And so, from my perspective, the automation is sort of the key. So I have a customer who built their VM pipeline image to build their custom image. And what they're actually going to do is they're going to have a release pipeline, build the image. And then once that release pipeline kicks off, they're actually going to go and deploy an ARM template with that new image to go and replace their entire host pool. So every time they make a change to their VM, they're automating the entire process of deploying and destroying and recreating that whole host pool. So it's really kind of a cool way of going about it, because you've essentially fully automated, your VDI deployment. And the whole way of doing that is to grab these sort of templates, and that makes it a little bit easier. So our VM creation link template is kicking off, and it looks like the VM got created, and now we're doing the DSC extension. So this is going to join the domain. If this fails, not join the domain, I'm sorry, this is going to join the host pool, different construct. And so if this fails, it is almost always networking, and specifically firewalls blocking traffic to Azure blobs. So this script goes and grabs a script from an Azure blob, and then it goes and grabs some executables for the agent off of an Azure blob. And so if it can't make those outbound calls to do that, it will fail. Also, if it can't talk to the WVD broker service, it will also fail. So the links that I sent out in the chat, one of them it's the second to last one. It's aka.ms/WVD safe URLs. That is one of the more important links. That is all the things you need to do on your firewall to make sure WVD works. So if you're doing sort of a zero trust approach, these are the things we need to whitelist. We give you DNS names. It's almost all port 443. Some 3389 I think is in there, but it gives you everything you need to configure a firewall to make this work. Some of the other ones are, WVD prerequisites and WVD requirements. I tried to make a lot of aka.ms links to make it really easy for you to get it. One other little piece of advice that I have while this is deploying, oh, it looks like the PowerShell DSC worked. So now it's the domain join. This is where things get interesting, because it could fail if my domain decides it doesn't want it to join, which it should. If I typed in my password wrong, that could be why. If I can't do the lookup, that could be why. And there's a lot of different reasons why a domain join might bomb out. It's almost always DNS though, right? And voila, it was very happy. So the domain join happened. It looks like it's still showing as going, but it said it was happy. So yep, deployment succeeded. My domain join works. So now if I go into my resource group, you're going to see the different constructs that exist. So I've got my workspace, I've got my virtual machine, I've got my NIC, I've got the disk, right? And Azure VM is really more than just the VM, it's the disk and the network as well. I've got my host pool. I wish there was a better way to view this. I'm going to just have to reset my view. Oops. And then I've got my desktop application group. So there's a number of constructs here that exist that have been created. And so in order, the VM itself, it's just a regular Azure VM. If you've ever deployed an Azure VM, you're not seeing anything too different. I can go and resize that VM if I want, right? I can connect to it directly on RDP, which you don't really need to do. It has networking, all the standard sort of stuff. Ultimately, though, if I want to provide access to that VM, right, I need to go into, I'm sorry, go to resource group. I'll need to go into that application group and actually provide some assignments. So earlier I said it was the workspace, it's actually the application group, so I apologize. By default, it's going to give you the session desktop. If you want to deliver apps, all you have to do is go in here and pick the packages that you want to add. So strangely enough, it's asking me for msix packages. So previously I could just add some of them. Let me actually go ahead and show you what that looks like. So if I go to my Windows Virtual Desktop and I go to my application groups, I have an apps group that is all remote apps. And so I can actually click the add button and add Windows, from the source, it's start menu essentially. So I can say, hey, it'll actually pull all the apps from the start menu. I can also do a file path, right? And so I can actually grab whatever apps are installed. So for instance, 7-zip file manager, not that you would ever want that to be streamed, or maybe git command or git CLI, right? Maybe I want to deliver git bash actually, right? And I can say git bash, right? And so now I'm adding git bash as one of the applications in this list of apps, and it should show up pretty quickly. Outside of that, I've got my new host pool, NE Bytes, right? So if I want to, I can actually, I can add more hosts to the pool. So all I got to do is hit this add button, and then it'll fill out this paperwork again. I can add msix packages. So this is a way of packaging up a Windows application and having it attached as a VHD, similarly to the user profile and FSLogix. Of course, I've got my application group, so that's either desktops or remote apps. One thing that's worth noting, a host can either deliver remote apps or desktop. It cannot do both. So it's really important to know that. This is the same as it was in the RDS days. So if you're an RDS person, you're used to this constraint. If you're new to VDI, this is a constraint. Ultimately, I can also set all the RDP properties. So I can actually go into this and say, hey, I don't want anyone to automatically reconnect. I want to do compression. I don't want to allow people to redirect microphones or cameras or disks, or I want to allow those things. So there's a lot of stuff you can play with. Pretty much anything that's an RDP setting in an RDP file is available here for you to configure. You can also set display settings. So you can say, hey, I want the resolution to always stay the same, or I want it to resize, right? I want to be able to give people the right to do multi-monitor. So if I'm using the FAT client, by default, it actually takes over all your monitors, which I find personally extremely annoying, but I'm sure there are people out there who find that useful. In my opinion, it's really an annoyance, which all I got to do is right click and change that setting in the FAT client. And then there's some advanced settings. So you can actually put in custom RDP settings. So like I said, anything that's an RDP setting can go in here, and we've got it pretty well documented. The host pools themselves also have some properties. So I can modify my load balancing algorithm, and I can change the session limit. I can also put in a friendly name. So I'm going to call it NE Bytes, right? And then all I got to do is hit save. Now, you might be asking, well, how do I put in who's allowed to get into this machine, right? How do I get in? How do I do that, right? And so that's where the application groups section kind of comes up. And so these are called assignments, and you will find that I can add anyone in my Azure AD in this list, including guests, but that doesn't mean they're going to actually get access, right? Because the challenge you face with a guest is a guest exists in your Azure AD, but they don't exist in the AD that the machine joins. And so how do we get those people to log in? Right? The answer is we don't. It doesn't work. And so that's not something that's supported. So I'm just letting you know it's one of those gotchas. I can deliver groups or I can do users. So I'm going to go ahead and add Linus, who's my dog. I'm going to add myself, right? Or I can add a group. So I can say, I'll go ahead and add maybe this, the all users group, for instance. That seems like a good thing to do. And now I've put those people in this host pool. And once I sort of refresh this page, once cloud time occurs, you should see the additional host pool appear. So, when I say cloud time, I'm basically saying the time it takes for that setting to replicate to my user account, which it could be a minute, it could be instantly, which here we are, it is instantly there. And so once we log in, you'll see I've got a Windows 10 machine. Ooh, it looks like it's still not happy. Interesting. Yeah, so the machine might still be baking. It looks like it might not be quite happy yet, so that's interesting. We'll try it again in a minute. Because it might not have given me the permissions just yet. And then of course I can actually set, whether a number of different friendly settings here. So I can say this is the NE Bytes desktop, put some friendly name information in there. And then of course, monitoring is the next big thing, right? And so there's actually a new link for monitoring that I'm going to go ahead and grab. But once you've deployed it, you get this configuration workbook. And so this configuration workbook will actually take you through step by step on how to set up monitoring. And so the first thing you'll do is pick a log workspace. So I'm actually going to choose my Azim Lab logs, and then I can hit configure host pool, and it'll actually deploy all the agents to the VM and configure it to talk to the workspace for you. So you don't have to actually set all that up. Then you got to go here into the session host data settings and select your workspace again. And then once you do that, you hit add host to workspace, and it'll once again deploy an ARM template to go ahead and do that. Then configure the performance counter. So you just kind of follow this like it's a wizard almost, and it'll actually go and tell those machines to start reporting into a log workspace, and then you get to sort of see some metrics. And so I'm gonna, because I've already done this on a previous host, I'm actually gonna show you what this looks like. Ooh, it's getting kind of crazy over here. I'm just gonna go ahead and refresh this page. There we go. Log analytics got kind of crazy. And I'm gonna actually go 30 days worth of data, just because I don't generate a ton of telemetry. But ultimately, you get a lot of pieces of information like info on the host pools, how well they're working, how well people are connecting to them, right? And like their success rate on those connections, right? So if someone has a problem actually connecting to the machine, if your users are giving you problems or complaining, right? It allows us the ability to sort of do some triage and troubleshooting, try to figure out, what's going on with these sessions. Is there issues, right? Are people having trouble signing in, right? Or maybe people are complaining about the performance of the host itself, like, hey, I'm getting all kinds of slowness on the machine, or I feel like there's input delay, things like that. And then even the utilization of the machine, like I want to understand, are my machines, over allocated, right? Are there a lot of people logging into them? How many active users? What kinds of, applications are running on those machines? So, there's I don't necessarily have all the data in here, but ultimately, this is the ability to sort of provide some information to try to do some troubleshooting. Because I'm only one user, that's why you're not seeing a ton of data here. But I can also kind of look at what clients are people using. Are you using the web-based client? Are you using the FAT client? Right? How many people are signing in? What users are using what, and what's their client look like? So it gives you a lot of ability to do some troubleshooting and help you drive towards solving that end user problem. Because the whole point of all of this stuff is to make your end users have a great experience so that they don't put in tickets. So, now that host pool, let me go ahead and try to sign into it again. And if not, I'm just going to blame the demo gods. There we go. Now it's happy. Demo gods have been happy, and they've blessed me today. So you'll see I'm logging in. Now, because I'm setting a group policy, FSLogix is already configured and stuff like that. So the way FSLogix works is it uses registry keys. And so I'm actually going to drill into that next, because I think it's important to talk about group policy as a means of configuring your VMs. Since they're joining a domain, joining the domain has this bootstrap thing that occurs. Once you join the domain, the machine policies apply on the next reboot, and user policies apply once the user signs in. And so by virtue of that, you can actually have these machines configured through group policy, and you don't have to do it as part of your image, which in my opinion is better, because then you can change that against existing machines or net new machines. It's one place to change the setting. I will be very frank with you. I am a lazy person. I do not want to do the same thing over and over again. I am someone who will automate something or find some other easier way to do it so that I don't have to keep doing the same job over and over again. I hope you are the same way, because there's no point in wasting your time doing the same thing over and over again. And so what I've done in my network is I've got a group policy for WVD. I've got a couple actually. So this one is for FSLogix, right? I've got another one that turns off this arrow shake when you shake the window around. It minimizes everything. That drives me insane. And then I've got some AD hybrid stuff so that my machine AD hybrid joins with Intune. Because if you're joining your on-prem and you have Intune, you can actually manage these machines through Intune or SCCM if you're an SCCM shop. Like I said, I'm lazy. I don't want to manage SCCM, so I use Intune or what we call Microsoft Endpoint Manager. I should probably get with the times, I guess. But ultimately, this FS Logics group policy does a couple things. So what I've done is I've actually created a special WMI filter, and maybe before I tell you what this is, I should tell you what a WMI filter is. So a WMI filter is Windows Management Instrumentation, and it's a way of sort of querying and getting back information from your domain or your machines on certain conditions. And so you could say, I want to filter on manufacturer is Lenovo or Dell, or I want to filter on Windows version is XYZ. In this case, I'm actually filtering where the operating system caption or friendly name is Microsoft Windows 10 for virtual desktops. And so I'm actually going to add this string into the chat for you so that you can have this and take this away. This is a really great way. I can basically target this GPO at the root of my domain and then use this WMI filter to only target that specific version of Windows. And now what I've done is I've created a group policy that no matter what machine, where it lands in my domain, it's going to get this group policy based on this operating system. You can also do the same thing with servers only or domain controllers only. So you don't need to use OUs as your only way of filtering out GPOs and stuff like that. This is a great way to deliver GPO filtering based on certain conditions. And so I try to use all the tools that I can to kind of target my machines and GPOs from a certain perspective. For instance, AD hybrid policies, like Azure AD joining servers works, but Intune joining servers, not really an option. And so it's one of those things where like you want to be very prescriptive in how you apply group policies. But what I've done here, and I'll go into the settings config, is I'm actually pushing FSLogix reg keys. And so the way FSLogix gets configured is you push reg keys to very specific spots in the registry that say, this is where I'm storing the user profile. This is what I want to do if there's a local profile. So for instance, if I had created a local profile, you can actually say, hey, keep that local profile or delete it in favor of using FSLogix's profile VHD on the share. And so the only thing you really have to do is turn on the enabled key, which is a 0 to 1, and then set the profile path. And you can actually put in, it's a multi-string value reg key. So you can actually put in multiple paths. That way, if you want, you can sort of mirror two storage accounts and, have a failover in like an east-west sort of scenario, and it'll loop through each one as it goes down. Don't know why this report is taking so long, but maybe what I'll do is I'll go into the GPO GUI and just show you what this looks like. Ah, yes, that's right. This is under one. There's two sets of GPO. You can either do it in the user context or the machine context. I chose the machine context because that happens on boot up with Windows, whereas the user context happens at user login. And so what I've done here is I've said, I want to delete the local profile when a VHD should apply. That way, if I ever log in the machine before this GPO sets off, right, it'll just delete that profile in favor of a VHD. Enabled the 0.1 that I was mentioning earlier, and then VHD locations. And this is literally this is an Azure file share that is storing that VHD profile. And what's also really cool is this is actually Azure NetApp files. So the last thing we'll probably talk about is the different backend storages that you can use for this, because this is really important. But ultimately, I just have this path in here. And so that's essentially in a nutshell how you configure FSLogix. There's a lot of other settings you can configure, but you really just need to know this to be from 0 to hero. So if you wanted to get more in depth with it, we absolutely could. Yeah, so these are all the different settings in the FSLogix config. So really, it's just these GPOs. And then I actually have a couple of different ones that I recommend. So one of the things that I do is I set the maximum size of a OneDrive that user can download automatically. So I don't want that user downloading their entire OneDrive. I do want it to sign in and show up, but I want it to be OneDrive files on demand. So what happens in OneDrive files on demand is only the files they access get downloaded. I also set Outlook cache settings to prevent their Outlook OST from getting really big, because I don't want to store a bunch of stuff on a VHD if that data is protected elsewhere, right? Really what I want is just to make that user experience nice and clean. So I do cache a little bit of Outlook data, but not much. And so that's kind of in a nutshell that FSLogix configuration and how you might set up FSLogix. What I'm going to do now is talk about the different storage backends. And so this is an important decision that has to be made, and there are different drivers for different making that decision. And so I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint deck because I know y'all love PowerPoint. And so I'm going to talk about the backend storage. So, you know, for these user profiles, you could choose either Azure files. So that's, you know, Azure storage account using SMB with Azure files. You can wire that up with private link if you want, so that it's all happening privately in a private network. You can use Azure NetApp files, which is essentially SMB serve as a service. It's a turnkey service. It's a native Azure service, so it's delivered by Microsoft, but it's using NetApp technology. That happens, that NetApp device actually is a VM, not a VM, it's a virtual appliance, if you will, that joins your domain and actually presents itself in a private network on a delegated subnet. And so that is a very high performant storage service. It's a little bit pricier, but if you've got enough users, it actually becomes very compelling because they have a minimum that you can provision of 4 terabytes. And so if you have enough users, and that magic number is typically around, I think, 30 or 40 users, it becomes worth it because you get a lot more performance and you're going to consume that full 4 terabytes. FSLogix default size for those VHDs is 30 gigs. And so, you know, once you get to a certain scale, it starts making sense to start. I think it might be 100 users actually. It starts getting to the point where you might actually want to use something like Azure NetApp files. The third option is the least sexy. It's running, you know, Windows servers hosting SMB shares either on like a cluster shared disk or, you know, whatever you happen to be attached to it, managed disks. You know, super unsexy. No one wants to do more IaaS. It's not really that interesting or cool. And so really Azure Files and Azure NetApp Files are both your top options. Azure Files is probably the lower cost one, but also, in my opinion, maybe a little lower performance and a little bit harder to wire up and connect you to your domain. Whereas Azure NetApp Files is really easy to stand up, very fast to perform, but it's a little bit pricier. And so I'm using Azure NetApp Files because I get free Azure from Microsoft because I work there. So if cost is no object, go with the Azure NetApp Files. Absolutely. And so, I mean, that is almost a zero to hero kind of in a nutshell. We've built our host pool, right? To recap, we've set up our, you know, we've demonstrated sort of that backend storage. We've talked about group policies. We've talked about the different constructs within WVD itself. We've talked about the different requirements and what you need at bare minimum to deploy a host pool. And I think we've kind of talked about the different use cases that might come up. So that's pretty much my zero to hero in about an hour. I know I'm a little over on time, but we also started a little late, but I'm going to open it up now to see if anyone has any questions or anything like that. Don't be afraid to come off mute.
I have a question if no one else does.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you get free access to hit me up for questions all the time. So,
well, it was one you mentioned early on about domain services and that kind of going away or being replaced or something. What's that going to look like?
Oh no, what I meant was Azure AD joining isn't available, but domain services isn't going anywhere.
Okay.
I'm sorry if that made that sound kind of weird. No, domain services is absolutely sticking around, and they're making more investments in that product. Actually, I just talked to a customer. They added a bunch of security to it recently. So if you've looked at yours, they've added some NTLM auth and some password sync settings to it, as well as this Kerberos arming thing, which I haven't really messed with at all. And then they've added a bunch of SKUs. So they've added this enterprise SKU and this premium SKU. But one other cool thing they've done is if you're on those higher SKUs, you can create replica sets where it actually you can, you know, originally you could only have one of these in one region. Now we can create what are called replica sets where we can deploy them in multiple regions.
So is there going to be more sort of management exposed through through this blade then, do you think?
Maybe a little bit. I still go in and install RSAT on my domain join services machine, and then I go and grab the ADMXs for Windows 10 and Office into that machine that I'm using to administer, and that's how I create my group policies and things like that, because I can't inject ADMXs into the policy store on the sysvol of the domain services. And so those kinds, just as an example, those kinds of things are how I administer my domain services for the most part at an AD level. There isn't much that I'm seeing coming through from the Azure portal other than some of these security settings and things like that. Usually all Azure specific stuff, pretty much.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
I mean, there's only 2 of you, so outside of Derek, so don't be afraid to come off mute. Yeah, and you know what I'll do is I'll also put in my email address in case people do have questions. Sometimes it's, questions come up down the road. I know it's probably a little late for y'all, so you may find yourself thinking, oh, tomorrow, I wanted to ask him this question. I forgot what it was, and now I remember it. So don't be afraid to email. That's fine.
Okay, well, if nobody has any other questions, then I guess we'll let you go. And thanks very much for that great presentation. And yeah, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all, and happy to provide any answers to any questions down the road, and look forward to hearing about other events. So thanks, Derek, for the opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you, and thanks everyone for joining. And hopefully we'll have an announcement soon about next month. Okay.
Thanks, Azim. Thanks, Derek.
Be safe.
All right.
Nice to meet you all.
Thank you now.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.